Hello, everyone.
Welcome. The
You're joined by
the
the shining Anglo Knight and the dark hidden pole.
exactly. We Slavs thrive in the darkness. Um, it's yet another thing that we have in common with the orcs.
So, Kuba, when are you invading Ukraine?
Um, I mean, if you listen to Russia, it's already taken place.
Yeah. You
Did you
know,
see that?
the only country which offered, I think I've said this before, the only country which directly offered to military intervene to help Ukraine is Belarus, but it was only against an entirely hypothetical Polish invasion.
The it's funny because if there were a Polish invasion of Ukraine, um, I kind of doubt that Belarus would really make that much of a difference.
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, it's funny how basically everyone before it was kind of expected that Ukraine would kind of win the war diplomatically or like through the internet or whatever. And it turns out they're actually shit at all that stuff, as has been revealed in the past day by the fact that like Western diplomats are getting increasingly frustrated and furious at them for insisting that it was a Russian missile which hit Poland. But they're great at conventional war, which everyone thought they'd suck at. So,
Well, the I think that there's still a old world mentality when it comes to like wartime communication, where the, it really is another front in military conflict, and even if it's obvious that the particular line is false, not even your allies are backing you up, you still have to commit to it. You have to
yeah.
go all in, because any admission that and maybe we should start by just saying what happened, and then we
Well, I was
can.
going to go back a bit more than that because when you initially suggested we had another one of these updates, I was saying like, well, not much has fucking happened since the last one. The main change had been that kind of there was a large scale the start of Russian attacks on Ukrainian electrical infrastructure. Something we talked about might have been something which was going to start to happen, but hadn't by the time of our last update. And then the other thing which happened during kind of the time we were planning to have this update, was that the Russians left Kherson, which is pretty incredible. And then since then, a couple of days ago, a Ukrainian air defense missile, as it turns out, while trying to shoot down Russian missiles targeting electrical infrastructure in the far western reaches of Ukraine, was taken down was attempting to take down a Russian missile, but the Ukrainian air defense missile struck, I think it was like a Polish farmhouse, and killed 2 Poles.
Yes, the in the border village of Przewodów, the what has now been identified as a Russian-built S-300 air defense missile, fired by Ukraine against a sizable volley of Russian missiles targeting the area around Lviv. Missed, went off course, was diverted, and flew into a Polish farmhouse. Maybe it was just terrible luck. The area is sparsely populated. If you were throwing a dart randomly, then you'd more than likely just hit a field. Or it may have been attracted to the farm equipment, because a tractor and some other gear was directly struck, and it killed 2 local Polish residents. The fact that this came at the same time as the Russian volley against Lviv, it wasn't just targeting electric infrastructure, although that was certainly one of the goals. But there's also an international peacekeeping center around Lviv, which at this point means military training. And
isn't that where they kept the Red Brigade at the start of the war?
It's possible. I'm not sure. But NATO trainers go in and out of there. That's where they work with their Ukrainian counterparts. That was struck. 35 people, I believe, were killed. And in trying to defend against that barrage, that's when the Ukrainians fired their S-300s, and one of them struck inside of Poland. Because it landed on Polish soil and there were Polish fatalities. The wreckage indicated Russian make. Initially, there were rumors that this was a Russian attack. A Russian missile had struck Poland.
Ukrainian officials said that if you said anything else, then you're supporting Russian conspiracy theories.
To be fair, the Russians said that if you said that was a naked provocation, and it's the responsibility.
Instead of suggesting, the Russians, of course, were ridiculous by suggesting that instead of it just being an accident, it was some kind of deliberate false flag.
Yes, the reality is that, as we can see, you can never trust either side. Both the Ukrainians and the Russians in their official announcements will play into whichever narrative is most suitable for them. And
my Russian friend was shocked that the West told the truth about this one.
Indeed, that's possibly the most remarkable thing. And if this were a conflict with any other power, except perhaps China, then that fear of escalation, which was the likely motivation for coming clean, might have been waved off. After all,
with the meeting they just had in Turkey, I was expecting the US to say, as with kind of the pipeline explosion, which was kind of just buried because it was politically inconvenient, I thought that America would say, if the Russians had done it, they would claim that aliens had done it, because they're really trying to push towards peace and don't want escalation. But as it turned out, the Russians didn't do it, so it became very easy for America to tell the truth.
Yes, and the counterfactual is interesting. If this had been a Russian missile fired by Russia, would you try to cover it up in order to prevent the invocation of Article 5, right? Like that, this is an open question. If you do have an inadvertent strike into a neighboring country, and Poland is the main artery for weapons and materiel flowing into Ukraine from the Western Alliance, it frustrates Russia to no end that they can't really do anything to interdict the supplies until they get to the border. And what happens if there is an accidental or deliberate strike like this into the territory of a NATO ally, which is entirely possible given that so much border infrastructure exists related to the war in Ukraine. And what we've seen is the broadening of Russian bombing campaigns from the center and areas of immediate tactical concern to Western regions, bringing down the power grid, among other things. And something like this could very easily happen with Russian missiles. If that's the case, do you invoke Article 5? Does it become an automatic tripwire?
Well, apparently Poland did invoke Article 4, which for me is a bit like invoking the Third Amendment or something, where it's like, oh, I didn't know the other ones actually did.
Yeah. That's an excellent point, right? Like Article 5 is sort of the only one that anybody cares about. Article 4 is just, I have the conch, right? I would like to speak. You must all listen to me. Article 4. You must all listen to me. Article 4. Which, frankly, it's not inappropriate in this circumstance. And Poland and the Baltic states had invoked it earlier when Russia invaded Ukraine proper. Article 4 doesn't require NATO escalation, but it is, it's hitting the panic button to get everyone to force a conference where NATO member states have to deal with what you're bringing on the agenda. So in a lot of cases, American troops specifically have been placed in allied countries, not just in Europe, but also in places like South Korea and the Gulf states, to act as a kind of human tripwire.
I was wondering if you knew, like the US has recently said it would go to go nuclear over Japan and South Korea. Is this new US policy, or is this consistent US policy?
Since the Korean War, the United States has extended its nuclear umbrella over South Korea and Japan. That's consistent with its position since the Cold War. And at that point, it was directed against the Soviet Union, since Japan was an essential component of American power projection in the Pacific. Now it's clearly aimed at China. In the Korean case,
see that the US threatened an unprecedented reaction if North Korea did a 7th nuclear test, which is a bit like, why? Like, why number 7? Like,
the numerology, I don't know. I remember that under Ronald Reagan, the last president of comparable age, and what's a euphemism for senility? The White House fell under the influence of Nancy Reagan, since she was closest to her husband and she could manage him. And therefore, the influence of Nancy Reagan's astrologer, who picked auspicious dates for summits and other key meetings.
He's a fucking Roman Emperor.
Well, why not, right? Look at the architecture; it makes sense. The auguries are good. It is time to escalate in Ukraine.
So, Kuba, when you initially wanted to talk about this update before the missile strike and even before the attack in Kherson, what was kind of the main thing that you wanted to discuss?
I wanted to talk about. There's a great deal of activity domestically within Russia, within Ukraine. And in terms of domestic mobilization, the need to keep the population on side, the need to present coherent narratives that can resonate diplomatically. Another interesting point is that in terms of their international image, and international diplomatic footing, Russia and Ukraine are dealing with two very different audiences. The Ukrainian diplomatic and information effort has to reach Western audiences, keep them involved, keep them engaged, work on the allies to maintain that flow of money and weapons that is essential to Ukraine's ability to fight. The Russian counter-narrative has given up entirely on convincing the West to, borrow a conventional phrase. It's not for you, right? The Russian narrative is an appeal to countries in the global South, as well as non-aligned and what could be described as what America likes to call rogue states, Iran, China, that in order to present this as part of a global effort to rein in the United States. And what's interesting too is in both cases, that clashes with the domestic narratives of mobilization, which we've touched on before a little. There's a lot of Slavic, quasi-Tolkienite national romantic mysticism behind the two sides in the war. They both have an almost metaphysical appeal to their compatriots. That this has to do with the soul of Russia. This has to do with identity, purpose, meaning, who we are as people, our place in the world, and fundamentally, you get to good and evil pretty quickly. And the one area that that I still wonder about is the extent to which Russia has been successful at popular mobilization. I don't necessarily mean that is there domestic dissent? Is there a peace movement like the U.S. had against the Vietnam War? But generally speaking, Putin is still very popular. His authority hasn't really been challenged or questioned. But that compliance, that kind of subordination of the Russian people, does that translate into being able to mobilize for conflict? Or is this just an extension of the default peacetime pragmatic obedience that is an essential survival skill if you live in an authoritarian state, especially one like Russia?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a thing of kind of Putin has found what the consequences of kind of the Bonapartist politics that he's been engaged with are, which is, yeah, it's all good when you're not really doing anything, when your country doesn't have to really be activated for any purpose, but can simply kind of go on, roll on, is kind of like a semi-colonial, semi-colonized, semi-great power or whatever, doing minor kind of, doing what America does, but at about 1/10 of the power or less, But when you actually need to significantly engage your country in a war, yeah, the kind of absolute limits of the Russian bourgeois politics becomes apparent. Because I don't think they've really, Russia hasn't been activated at all, really. Did you see the only public protest against the surrender of Kherson?
Do you mean the Nazbol who gave a Sieg Heil on a picnic table?
Oh, she also slit her wrists, but yeah, I mean,
I saw. Is that what you were referring to? There was also what seemed like a very well. What's the euphemism for staged march in St. Petersburg, calling for reprisals against the West after the loss of Kherson. But tell me more about the protest that you're referring to.
No, I was just mentioning it as kind of like an aside, and to reveal through the kind of lack of anything else what the reaction is, because Kherson is kind of like, it's really big. Like, I think psychologically, it's the biggest defeat of the war from Russia, and it didn't come it can be very stabbed in the back myth, right? Because Russia didn't lose there, never lost there in any conventional way. Were never forced back by the Ukrainians by kind of direct force of arms, but seemingly because of basic degradation, and especially because of supply problems, which directly caused by these HIMARS, which turned out to actually be a real Wunderwaffen instead of kind of all the previous fake ones. So losing Kherson is Russia's biggest defeat of the war. It's a major psychological blow. It was the only functional city they'd captured in Ukraine, because obviously Donetsk and Luhansk had previously been blown up by Ukrainian artillery, and then they've blown up Mariupol, Severodonetsk, and other places with their own artillery. So Kherson was really important. It would be kind of a test bed for kind of like a Russian Ukraine, where they could test out kind of trying to give people a better living standard than in the rest of Ukraine. And it would be much easier there because, again, it hadn't been blown to bits. And now they just kind of left. And I think the fact that Russia's biggest defeat of the war has not really been marked that much in kind of Russian popular stuff, like popular media, like kind of they talk about it, but it shows, and obviously that's because of the Kremlin's grip on the media, but it also shows at the same time the limits of that strategy, because people aren't furious about Kherson, but if they had been activated in a nationalist way, they would be furious about Kherson. If the war was deeply popular in a way of not just passive acceptance, but wanting active or indirectly to participate, people would be furious about Kherson, and they probably are upset and confused, but there's not like a national gripping fury.
I think that your comparison with the United States is a very illustrative one, because American politics, apart from the biannual ritual of presidential and midterm elections, is a politics of popular demobilization. You want people to vote, and then you want people to go home and forget about it. There's a bit of a conflict of interest between the political media, which Fox, but not just Fox, right? Everyone likes to bring up Fox, but the reality is that the Washington Post, all of the respectable liberal outlets had banner year. They had good times under Trump, and now it's much harder to get people to pay attention. But apart from that advertiser, profit-driven, entrepreneurial, commercial impulse to keep people watching, the political parties, for instance, demobilize very quickly after elections. That was one of the great criticisms of Obama, that he had managed to galvanize a political movement, which included a lot of young people, a lot of first-time voters. He was tremendously personally popular, and he could have, like Trump, used that popularity to apply pressure for his political initiatives. He could have summoned his troll army to go after opposition to Obamacare, for instance. But instead, he immediately demobilizes people. Similarly, George W. Bush, when asked after September 11th what people could do to contribute to the war effort, he told them to go shopping. So I think that there's an awareness on the part of modern leaders that there's a risk and a danger in mobilizing the population, that any force substantial enough to make a difference on your behalf can also turn against you and create more headaches, create more problems. It also creates a new power center that maybe you can hand off to one of your cronies, put Medvedev in charge of the popular mobilization, but it can also produce its own leaders that might not be beholden to you. And it might elevate figures that have ambitions of their own.
Did you hear about the death of the deputy governor of Kherson?
No, what happened?
Well, it was reported about a week ago, like the day that Russia was announcing their withdrawal, that he was hit by a car. And then finally today, photos of said car have been released. And first off, it looks like it was struck by an IED. And second off, there's bullet holes in it. So who knows if Ukrainian intelligence killed him or Russian intelligence killed him. But I don't think he was hit by a truck.
Yeah, the level of, and this is partly a consequence of what we talked about earlier, the information control and the mentality around information control on both the Ukrainian and Russian side, where there's what you say is what is useful to you, tactically, operationally, rarely strategically, because if it's hard to have enough of a big picture view to know which lie will be useful 6 months from now. But there's no bias towards accuracy. You can just say what you want. And a few nerds that are already compromised will maybe figure out that you're not telling the truth online. And you may create if you've obfuscated or fabricated claims about a significant event, then, you might create a conspiracy theory that sticks. But even when, and I should say that this isn't even an Eastern thing, when thinking back to the war in Syria and
that's when the internet war was born.
Yes, and I'd be curious to hear your take on the gas attacks that served as the prompt for American airstrikes.
I mean, the funny thing about the gas attacks was it's kind of that thing of like, there was thermite in the towers, but also the planes hit them. Some of the gas attacks were fake and some of them were real. And some of them were conducted by the government and some of them were undertook by the rebels. And lots of them happened, but were like massively kind of hyped up, but beyond what actually happened, Yeah. I can't remember exactly which one. You mean the one in 2018 when Trump did some useless cruise missile strikes afterwards?
Yes. And I know that there was a UN agency that a staff attached to the Anti-Chemical Weapons Treaty that significantly challenged the narrative
that was around Duma.
Yes.
Yeah, that was probably the 2018 attack. Yeah, that was the whole thing. I think in the end, I don't know. It's obviously with this stuff, there's a lot of kind of imperial power behind pushing a certain narrative. But I think, as it turned out, the kind of whistleblowers were mostly incorrect. But they were obviously correct in the sense that the OPCW was massively rushing into things. And they were basically rubber stamping American actions when they hadn't like touched the site, you know, because they obviously couldn't. And we're just kind of using like testimonials and stuff to be like, yeah, it was a gas attack. I think in the end it was a gas attack, but that's still like, you know, if it's like Saddam could have had weapons of mass destruction, but then it could have still been a bullshit story to invade, you know.
Yeah.
I think everyone was surprised that he didn't have any in the end, you know.
Yes, this is true. I think even the Iraqis may have been surprised.
Right, because I mean, I think it was Chris Catrone who said this. Like, even Saddam wanted everyone to think he had chemical weapons, because without chemical weapons, he's just kind of some idiot who lost to Iran.
Precisely. If you can't have a mystique of violence and power around you, then what's the point of being a dictator? And also, you might not be one for very long. And speaking of punctured mystiques, and this takes us back to Kherson, right? This was the one region where Russian gains seemed durable. And the previous counteroffensive, the previous Ukrainian counteroffensive had failed.
And the attacks they were doing at the time seemed to also fail. They were not going very well. And like the Russians were finally releasing like a lot of footage, and it looked really quite horrible for the Ukrainians.
And it was, and it looks like, as you said, Russian forces weren't defeated or destroyed tactically. They weren't forced back under heavy fire. They gave up Kherson. Giving up a position that's indefensible is a perfectly legitimate approach to warfighting. Why would you sacrifice valuable manpower, valuable resources on a doomed effort? But it still looks bad. And now,
in the summer, the withdrawal from Kherson was already requested then by the general who at the time was in charge of the South Front, and is now in charge of the whole Ukraine. I can't remember his name because in Western media they only call him General Armageddon, and that is kind of like totally obscured all the other facts about him. I also call him Dr. Doom. But the interesting thing there is
Surovikin.
Yeah, he was militarily he was right to request Russia withdraw then, but politically I completely agreed with Putin's refusal, his initial refusal, because if you withdraw from Kherson, then what the fuck is the point? Why don't just you go home and stop?
Precisely. Russia already gave up on the Kiev northern front. It's been pushed out of Kharkiv. The south was the only area where it looked like there were some durable gains. But with the retreat from Kherson, the Dnieper does serve as a very defensible line that gives you a little bit of territory before the Crimean Peninsula. But what do you even have, right? It begins to look like Ukrainian victory, right? Like the Ukrainians are bit by bit pushing out the Russians, who at this point the best they can do is launch volleys of missiles against civilian infrastructure in a fit of pique. Now, that may work, right? And I think that what we're seeing is a shift in the Russian approach from a short war decided operationally to a long grinding strategic economic conflict, which is not great. And the part of that involves converting all of Ukraine into the type of broken rubble that that Syria became in the end of the conflict. The water, electricity.
I was thinking of Gaza.
The great difference between Gaza and Ukraine is that without Poland to play Egypt's role of partner jailer, Ukrainians can escape and Ukraine can be resupplied and rebuilt.
Yeah, and that's why if you want to be a minor imperial power, hang out with America, because otherwise it doesn't work.
Yeah, if you Russia, and this is in some ways we're seeing now one conventional reading of this conflict that's very popular on the left, and that I believe is partly correct, it's partly sound, was that by making aggressive moves into territory that was strategically important for Russia, NATO provoked a defensive reaction and now is paying the price. That NATO expansion was unnecessary and provocative, and this is the end point. Now, a different reading would be that, and fundamentally, that requires having a particular view of Russia, right? That Russia is a great power. Great powers have they value their autonomy, they value their sovereignty, they are threatened by the actions of other powers. The United States had demonstrated that it was untrustworthy because of its moves in the post-communist space, not just in terms of NATO expansion, but also the recommendations for privatization that devastated the Russian economy, right? The role of American advisors in pushing economic and political snake oil. So Russia would, of course, react. That does foreclose the possibility of Russian leadership, which is more pragmatic in accepting a subordinate role in somebody else's international order. And as you pointed out, if you're going to be a minor imperial power, it helps to have the United States on side. The way that the conflict is playing out, well, Ukraine certainly is benefiting from a willingness to get with the program in terms of Western interests in the region. Other countries that have also got with the program are now EU members as well as NATO members, and they have a block of support, which includes the would-be global hegemon, the United States, in their diplomatic and strategic efforts on their own. They have to be willing to take no for an answer from Brussels, Berlin, and Washington, but there are upsides to that arrangement for local powers. Maybe Russia should have given up on helping its Serbian younger brothers or maintaining a Black Sea fleet and cut a deal that would have given it some other types of benefits in exchange for freezing China out of its market or coordinating on a more consistent footing economically with the West.
I mean, it's hard, right? Because Russia's really big.
Oh, yes.
Like, they could never join the European Union, right? Because they'd have twice as many MEPs as Germany would have.
That's at the same time, you don't necessarily need to join the EU. You could have a Norway-Switzerland deal where you have access to the common market, maybe even free movement of people, but you're not part of the governance structures. You could potentially have some other arrangement that's custom built for you as a Eurasian partner, all of this requires accepting Western hegemony, and there's very good reasons not to. But if this is where that defiance got you, what good was that defiance?
Throughout the war, Russia's been selling processed aluminum to the United States, which the United States then reprocesses into weapons, which it sends to Ukraine. Kind of Russia is like economically a semi-colony with like an enormous army.
Yeah, it was just during the Cold War, the Soviet Union was described as Upper Volta with rockets. And
they also gave Upper Volta rockets.
The rockets for everybody. And that's one of the paradoxes of the Soviet and the Russian economy. They are able to produce raw materials, strategic materials, hard infrastructure, machinery on a mass scale at relatively low cost, gear and equipment that's reliable, it works well, is often competitive with Western alternatives, but for some reason it can't translate that into a commercial economy with self-sustaining growth path, with indigenous innovation and technological development. And this marks it considerably out from China, which has been able to achieve that. And part of that may have to do with the fact that, for a time at least, in accordance with the Maoist maxim that you hide your strength, China was able to tap into not just the capital, but also the technology of the West. It used developmental models that had succeeded in other Asian countries, specifically Japan and South Korea, but also even the small tigers, as instruments to legally force the transfer of technology. But for between the 70s and the 90s, China, even into the early 2000s, China was not an assertive foreign policy player. It largely ceded the security and political environment of East Asia and Southeast Asia to the West, and had to focus on its domestic affairs with a military unable to really project project its force, especially overseas. And Russia hadn't gone through that 30 years of quiet tutelage. It hadn't been climbing its way up the international supply chain. Instead, its economic model was more a revamped, retrofitted Soviet economy, which still largely pumped oil and other raw materials abroad. So the
I mean, the Russian kind of nationalist idea is that, you know, it's impossible for that the West is like pathologically fixated on breaking up Russia. And obviously you saw kind of it's like a psychic upsurge of this around the start of the war, where like kind of there was like I mean, it's something you've seen like kind of expressed in online culture for decades. Of people love to post maps of a broken up Russia, and especially maps of a broken up China. There seems to be like a real focus on it. Obviously,
although, how many maps are there of a broken up United States?
That's the other one, but that's like Freudian, you know, like that's Americans doing it to themselves, you know, and like getting. But there's also like that's kind of a way to express things about other Americans, right?
Well, what's interesting to me, speaking of, there is that Russians also produce maps breaking up countries. I think most famously, Medvedev published a map of a partitioned Ukraine.
Right.
Which is very weird, actually, since one, it gives Poland most of the West, which right there was no particular affinity for Medvedev between and Poland. Romania gets a big chunk for no reason, apparently, except maybe to serve as a buffer between the Polish-Ukrainian territories and the Russian-Ukrainian territories, while Ukraine itself ends up being kind of a New Jersey-sized statelet around Kiev.
Which is weird, because if there's anywhere which is Ukraine, it's Lviv, not Kiev, right?
Well, the Kiev is much more of a Russian city than Lviv, for instance, right? Linguistically and culturally. Lviv is a bit of a touchy subject because it's only been a Ukrainian city since 1945. And
but when did they make up Ukraine?
Sorry?
When did they make up Ukraine?
Lenin made up Ukraine. Didn't you hear Putin? Yeah. Right?
The actual Russian national story is the Austro-Hungarians deliberately made up Ukraine, which like has like they tried, but you know.
Well, also all of these narratives, and there's leftist variants of them. They all consist of, here's something that happened. Who are the political masterminds, right? And because
the thing that was criticized by Nietzsche and Foucault, right, that by doing archaeology you reveal something, as if when you dig down and you get to the very start, there's something perfect and amazing that you revealed, which dominates all present conditions if you can just find the origin, which of course is like, well, no, it's not. Like, there's nothing that's more perfect about the origin than the end, right? And so the fact that kind of these people thought themselves were Russians and then thought themselves were Ukrainians, it's like, so what?
I mean, also there are forces outside of the control of political leadership, right? Even if they aren't necessarily incoherent, if they aren't necessarily coherent or have a narrative of their own that they're forwarding, popular revolts, revolutions, the everyday resistance of people insisting on doing things locally their own way, that adds up. And a national renaissance doesn't need to be puppet mastered in every instance. The linguistic distinction between Ukrainian and Russian is longstanding, and for much of the 19th century, right, it was Russia's state building project, nation building project, to standardize the Russian language, impose it on all of the territories, use it as the exclusive language of officialdom and education. It was that effort that triggered a response from people who maybe didn't want to learn Russian. Maybe they thought that what they were speaking was good enough. And now a lot of those narratives have come back. There's a high level of popular hostility towards Russia in Ukraine. Can't really blame them, right? Like,
and also, but before 2014, Russia was wildly popular, with about 90% approval ratings to like 5% disapproval. And up until this war, like in February, there was still a positive opinion by most Ukrainians in Russia. You know what I fucking mean?
mm-hmm. It is, not all of that was inevitable either. I think that we can point to Zelensky personally making a difference in presenting a model of an appealing Ukrainian personal bravery, valor, courage. I'm just using synonyms for bravery now, but like
those brave, courageous boys.
Exactly. And you know, he's an elected leader, right? To a certain extent, Ukrainians can claim credit for Zelensky, and unlike Putin, who has been around long enough and after enough dodgy elections, so that he really is distinct from the Russians who once upon a time elected him. But Zelensky, as a peacetime president, had dismal approval ratings. To a certain extent, good administration is not really a Slavic virtue. It's something that people appreciate and that they aspire to, but it's not the most immediately admirable, right? Immediately appealing quality. In fact, there's something kind of German about it.
Well, often kind of administrating well when the state is set up in a way which isn't very nice is often worse than administrating badly, right? Because you get all the parts working and people are like, wow, all the parts fucking suck.
Yes, exactly. In a lot of ways, East Germany was the quintessential effort at trying to combine sound administration with Soviet-style political and economic policy, and you end up with a prison state. Similarly, North Korea, right? It's one may quibble with how it's governed. Say what you will about Juche, but the state apparatus in Korea is effective. It does what it sets out to do, which makes it all the clearer how monstrous a regime and system that it actually is.
So it does also reveal that kind of having a monstrous state isn't the worst thing that could happen to you, because you still far rather live in North Korea than you would in Niger.
That is, that's debatable, right? Because
okay, well, we can debate that in the parrot room, which we'll soon be going to.
Yeah, I would contend that at least you can get out of Niger.
That's true, though it often involves drowning.
Oh, or being sold on an auction block in the self-declared emirate in former Libya.
Yeah, or falling off like a fucking electrical posts in those Spanish enclaves.
Yeah, Cueta is one of them.
I mean, I know how it's spelled, but I didn't know how it was said until you just said it. I would have said like Quetta or something.
Yeah. Oh, it's weird. I thought it was Cueta. It's Ceuta. So.
Yeah, I mean, I'm dyslexic, so.
Kuta? Anyway, doesn't matter. But like, yeah, the.
Do you have any last remarks you want to get in for the plebs before we get rid of them and go on to Patreon?
It wasn't a Russian missile.
No, maybe it was a Soviet missile. I think those missiles were produced in Ukraine throughout the whole Soviet period.
Excellent point, right? And that's another element here, right? Russia has been losing more and more as territories and regions broke off and joined the West. You had this whole reorientation of trade that is another way in which the post-Soviet Russian economy has really shrunk and diminished. It's weird to think, but Poland and Hungary were drivers of innovation in the Eastern Bloc, or at least significant contributors. The Soviet Union was, of course, the biggest show in town, but the Eastern Bloc itself was not nothing. And Russia has lost all of that. It could previously just demand that its satellites play whatever role in the economy it deemed most advantageous for itself. But now it either needs to adjust to rules of the game that are imposed by the West and international institutions dominated by the West, or it can try to change the game. But if this is what changing the game looks like, maybe that's not such a great idea.
The game's got hands.
Sorry?
The game's got hands.
The game's got hands, right? Not everybody has the same hand.
Yeah, but tough.
Mm-hmm. But yeah. So let's go to the parrot room and see where that takes us. But hopefully not Kherson.
I was thinking, like, is Kherson even like a nice place? Is it like a well-respected city? I don't think so.
Yeah, I mean, the name itself, I'd be curious to know its etymology. It sounds Turkic to me.
The whole thing about Kherson region is that there's like Kherson, which is like 95% of the population, and there's fucking nothing.
Yeah.
Which is why it was so much more embarrassing for Russia. But let's go.
All right.
Bye, everyone.